right, well, welcome one and all to our second Leadership Circles presentations of Legends of the Halls. I'm Diane Elstrom Devine, Development Officer with the Leadership Circles of Giving program here at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, and we're excited you could join us this evening. Our Legends of the Hall series focuses on some interesting past events and people of the museum and the impacts they had in shaping who we are today. During this evening's presentation, please feel free to ask any questions you may have through the chat or question and answer tabs you'll see on your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as possible at the closing. Tonight's program, entitled Legends of the Halls, Digging into an Archaeologist's Past, takes a close look at the life and work of David Banks Rogers, who founded the museum's Department of Anthropology when he joined the staff in January of 1925. And who better to bring this story to you than our presenter this evening, Dr. John Johnson. Dr. Johnson has served as Curator of Anthropology at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History for 34 years. He received his Ph.D. in Anthropology at UC Santa Barbara in 1988. For 17 years, he has taught an annual course on California Indians at UCSB, where he holds an appointment as Adjunct Professor of Anthropology. Dr. Johnson's written contributions include more than 100 studies regarding the cultures, history, and prehistory of California's native peoples, especially emphasizing the Chumash Indians of the Santa Barbara region. So, without further ado, it is my honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. John Johnson, and digging into an archaeologist's past.
Thank you, Diane. Yes, I'm going to talk today about truly a legend of our museum's past, and that's David Banks Rogers. I'm holding in my hand here the book. In fact, the very first book published at our museum by one of our curators. It was published in 1929. It's David Banks Rogers' book, Prehistoric Man of the Santa Barbara Coast. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this as I discuss Rogers' life and career. And I've been interested in Rogers. I, of course, was familiar with his book, and we work with his collections all the time here at the museum. But I didn't really know much about Rogers the man. And so over the years, I've delved from time to time into his background. And I'm going to share with you tonight, what I've learned about him. So this is a photograph that was taken in 1923 in Santa Barbara. And the two men you see before you on your left is John Peabody Harrington, who is very famous for studying Chumash Indians and other California Indians and other American Indians, worked for the Smithsonian Institution and grew up here in Santa Barbara before he became a legendary anthropologist in his own right. And then on the right is David Banks Rogers. And this photograph was taken during their excavations at what later became, or what was then called Burton Mound. Today, what's left of Burton Mound is called Ambassador Park, there on the Santa Barbara waterfront. And they're showing some of the artifacts there in front of them that were discovered as part of their expedition. So, but let's go back in time. I'm going to give you kind of an overview of Rogers' life before then I get into the particulars of his career here at the museum. Well, Rogers was born in 1868 on a farm in Paw Paw, Illinois. When he was young as a boy, his father relocated the family to Kansas, where he had bought a ranch. And he tried ranching in western Kansas, and Rogers spent part of his teenage years there. But that ranch didn't succeed. There was apparently a series of drought years about that time. And so the father then gave up ranching and became a merchant in a different town in Kansas. And Rogers went to high school, where he graduated in 1887, and then went on to study at the University of Kansas. He also began teaching school himself about that time. In 1891, he married Emma Hinshaw, and they had one daughter who unfortunately died as an infant. And then we really don't have a lot of to go on about Rogers' life about this time. except that we find him listed in census records and city directory as working as a shipping clerk in Lawrence, Kansas between 1900 and 1920. Now, this is just 3 years before he comes to Santa Barbara and gets involved here in directing the excavations at Burton Mound. So where did he get his archaeology training and background? It's still a bit of a mystery, which we'll be talking about. He worked in Burton Mound, as I said, in 1923 with John Harrington. He then, a year later, began working on and off for the Museum of Natural History. They were just, some of the trustees were just funding him for particular projects, specific excavations at different sites. But the following year, they liked what he was doing and he became a permanent staff member at the museum. And he then conducted for the next 3 years intensive archaeological field work along the Santa Barbara coast and on the Channel Islands. And this resulted then in our very first museum book, Prehistoric Man of the Santa Barbara Coast, which was published in 1929. In 1935, Rogers' wife died, and 1935, and then 3 years later, he retired as a curator at age 70. In 1939, he remarried his second wife, Lucille Derbyshire, who was a teacher here in Santa Barbara. And he moved into her family home, which is up in the Samarkand area. And then in 1956, Rogers died here in Santa Barbara. So that's an overview of his life. And let's go back to now when he's still back in Kansas. You know, where did Rogers get his training as both an archaeologist and paleontologist? Well, we know in the time that he was living and going to school in Kansas and teaching in Kansas, he got involved in archaeology somewhere in there. And we also know this is at the time that Barnum Brown, who was a paleontologist, was also at University of Kansas. And Barnum Brown is the one who discovered Tyrannosaurus Rex. He's very famous for that discovery. And then, you know, by 1901, which by then Rogers was living in Lawrence, Kansas, the Museum of Natural History was founded. So I suspect that Rogers was somehow connected with the Natural History Museum at the University of Kansas. And his biographies states that he received an honorary Ph.D. then in Kansas in 1903. However, we know that his main income was working as a shipping clerk in a company in Lawrence, Kansas that made horse collars. So we wonder, where did he actually gain his archaeological experience? He says in some of the biographical information about him that he had worked in Central America on archaeological projects, that he had worked in the Mediterranean area. And so this opens up a question. There's still more research to be done to kind of fill in our gaps in our knowledge about Rogers. But he definitely did have prior experience in archaeology, as we shall see. And in 1923 then, he shows up in Santa Barbara, arriving here to work at the Burton Mound with John Harrington. Now, we're not sure how he was connected to Harrington. Did they know each other prior to this time? Had they met each other? Or was he someone who was known to George Heye, who was funding the excavations at Burton Mound? George Heye founded the Museum of the American Indian in New York, and he was collecting material culture of American Indians all up and down the Americas for his museum. That museum today is the foundation of the National Museum of American Indian at the Smithsonian. And so George Heye was funding Harrington's work at Burton Mound, and maybe he is the one who asked Harrington to hire Rogers to direct the excavations. This is a photograph that was taken showing in the middle distance, or in the Potter Hotel. Potter Hotel was built on top of what was called, once called Burton Mound, named after Lewis Burton, who once lived up there. And so the Potter Hotel was sitting on top of a major archaeological site. And it was well known that that site was there because a lot of artifacts had been uncovered when the hotel was being built. And so here's a photograph, or here's a postcard of the Potter Hotel, the way it looked, sitting on top of a Burton Mound. And you'll see that long driveway coming up to the front entrance of the hotel. So this is what the Santa Barbara waterfront looked like up until 1922. And it was the waterfront was dominated by this grand hotel. But something happened. In 1922, a fire started at the hotel and the hotel was completely destroyed. Here's a photograph showing that taking place, that destruction taking place. Well, once the hotel had burned down, John Harrington realized here was an opportunity that this very famous archaeological site, they could go in and see and do some excavations. And he managed to get detailed from his job at the Smithsonian Institution to work for the Museum of the American Indian, being funded by their founder and director, George Heye. And so here is the map that Rogers published in his book, showing the Burton archaeological site where Burton Mound is located today. And then on the lower right is a second site that Rogers called Omolomo. We actually know today that that was the location of the Chumash town that existed on the Santa Barbara waterfront at the time Europeans arrived. It was really called Siuktun. And the name Omolomo apparently refers to the mound itself. It may even mean mound. And so that name was kind of misapplied to the wrong site. But you can see Burton Mound there, and it's surrounded by this very ancient marsh, as Rogers shows, and there's the street map overlaid on the, the site is shown in vis-a-vis the streets as they existed back when the excavations took place. So Rogers was hired as the field director, and in fact, he did most of the excavations and whereas Harrington was out and about doing other things, as we shall see. Anyway, this was Rogers' map that's showing where his excavations took place, that all the black, that black section that's on that driveway heading up to the front entrance of the hotel. That was where Rogers' trenches and pits were located, where he concentrated his excavations. And he wrote almost daily to John Harrington. There's 25 letters, which are essentially detailed field reports written each day, and they cover the period from beginning of August to about September 18th. And in these letters, as I said, he gives detailed information to Harrington. So these are a permanent record of what was going on at Burton Mound that are part of Harrington collection at the Smithsonian Institution. Anyway, one of the things that Rogers reveals in these letters is that he came down through the midden and he kept encountering this very compact, hard soil that they didn't think anything was there, and it was full of caliche. It was very compact, and they couldn't dig easily into it. And so they would stop whenever they reached that hard, compact layer, until one day they noticed that there was a stone tool, a knife that was embedded into that hard layer. And all of a sudden they realized that maybe there was an earlier period represented at Burton Mound that they had not been aware of. And then Rogers excavated in there, and they found some skeletons that were buried very different than the burials that had been in the midden overlying that hard, compact layer. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So here's a photograph taken by Rogers, taken of Rogers. There he is in the pit on the lower right, and some of the people are looking into the pit to see what he's been finding. This is taken there at Burton Mound in 1923. And Harrington, in the meantime, was doing what he loved to do best, which was going out and interviewing people, especially Chumash Indians, and gathering information about what old timers remembered about Burton Mound, and doing ethnographic and linguistic work with Chumash descendants. The woman on the right is Mariana Hall, who lived her entire life here in Santa Barbara. She lived, gosh, I think she lived to be 100 or pretty near 100 years of age, dying in the 1960s. But Mariana Hall was half Chumash. Her father was an English seaman, but her mother was a Chumash woman from Ventura. And she was one of the people Harrington interviewed about her memories of growing up in coastal Santa Barbara. And this photograph also includes George Heye. He's the second man in the back from the left with his wife next to him, Thea Heye, and some of the dignitaries from the Museum of the American Indian as well. And then Mariana Hall's two grandchildren are also in this photograph. So she cooked a big meal for them. Harrington arranged for her to cook a big meal for them when they were visiting Santa Barbara to see the excavations. And Harrington also, he was busy planning an event for the Ventura County Fair, which was held in the fall of 1923. And here is a photograph taken at that event of a bunch of Indians from South Central California. It includes people from up in the vicinity of Mission San Miguel, north of San Luis Obispo, out at Tejon Ranch and Santa Rosa Rancheria in the San Joaquin Valley. And then the two women in the center are Lucrecia Garcia and her sister. Lucrecia is on the right, her sister Juliana Ignacio on the left. And they were from Santa Barbara. So the man in the foreground was a Chumash shaman, a Yokuts shaman, Tachi Yokuts from Lemoore, from the Santa Rosa Rancheria, who performed an Indian dance at the Ventura County Fair. So Harrington was very busy doing all these other things, and Rogers was busy doing the excavation. So this is a photograph. There's Harrington on the far left, Rogers standing there in the center, and some of the local dignitaries who were visiting the excavations. And here are Harrington on the right, Rogers in the middle, and then on the left is a man named George Bailey, not to be confused with George Bailey, the hero of It's a Wonderful Life. This George Bailey lived here in Santa Barbara and was Harrington's childhood friend when the two of them grew up in Santa Barbara. And here they have some of the artifacts that had been excavated there at Burton Mound shown in front of them. Harrington published a monograph on his work at Burton Mound, or actually he called it his preliminary report, but it was published by the Smithsonian Institution. And in it, he says, I want to express my indebtedness to my friend's professor, David Banks Rogers. So he calls Rogers a professor, again, indicating that Rogers had some academic credentials, presumably from University of Kansas, and Mr. George Bailey, who were with me during almost the entire work and contributed in innumerable ways to its progress. So one of the things that happened towards the fall of 1923 is that Rogers' discovery of these skeletons that were buried in this calcareous compact layer that was beneath the more recent midden. One of the things that they concluded was this was a much earlier time period. And Harrington proposed, I must have said something to some newspaper reporter, that he thought that this could be as old as 25,000 years old. And this got headlines. It went viral. And across the country, there was this statement that very early ancient Pleistocene man had been found in Santa Barbara. However, it was quickly countered by some of the leading anthropologists of the country, including Alfred Kroeber up at Berkeley, who doubted that it was really as old as what the newspaper reports stated. Well, the thing even blew up a little bit more. And before we knew it, Harrington's comments got blown up to be a new species of hominid called Homo barbarensis. And, or at least this is the label the newspapers gave it. And there is some wildly imaginative illustration of what Homo barbarensis may have looked like. And Harrington, apparently now they're stating that this may go back at least 300,000 years. Of course, this is before, we know now that this is before our species probably was even in existence. But Harrington, in fact, almost lost his job at the Smithsonian over some of the sensationalist stories that emerged out of this, their excavations at Burton Mound. But the other thing that happened was that with all this press and notoriety, the owners of the property shut down the dig. And so no further excavations then took place by the fall of 1923. So Harrington then, he decided that he wanted to invest in property in Santa Barbara. So he bought a lot in Santa Barbara, and he then had this building built on the lot to store his car when he was back in Washington, D.C., and he could leave his touring car in the garage. And then he used it for storing some of the artifacts and all of the papers that he continually accumulated through his ethnographic interviews that he was doing. And so this is a photograph showing Harrington on the left. That's David Banks Rogers in the middle and George Bailey on the right. They had built and constructed this ironclad building. They called it the Ironclad. And that building still stands today in Santa Barbara, in fact. Anyway, there is a continuing correspondence that Rogers has with Harrington. Harrington was soon no longer in Santa Barbara, and he left Rogers to pack and ship what Rogers said were tons of material from Burton Mound sent back to the Museum of the American Indian. Harrington also, or Rogers also sent Harrington some follow-up information based on interviews that he had conducted around Santa Barbara with some old timers. And he also discussed, he hadn't given up hope for getting back to further work at Burton Mound. And in his letters, he also discussed other sites that needed investigation with Harrington. And the two of them hatched a plan, apparently, that they wanted to then do a series of excavations on sites all along the Santa Barbara coast. And this is what Rogers ended up doing once he was hired by our museum. But at this time, it was just a plan that the two of them had discussed together. But Rogers wanted money. You know, he couldn't afford to just do all this for free. And so in one of his letters, he says, "Oh, for the funds to proceed," dropping a big hint to Harrington that maybe Harrington could get some financial support for Rogers to keep going. Well, what Rogers didn't know was that Harrington had pretty much been cut off by George Heye at the Museum of the American Indian. Some of that tons of material that was shipped by Burton Mound, George didn't impress George Heye very much. There were some very beautiful and finely made artifacts, but there was also other things that he didn't appreciate, like soil samples and other things that archaeologists collect and were shipped to him. And he also was wanting Harrington to be more efficient about writing up the results of the excavation. And Harrington, as far as he's concerned, was dragging his feet. So he cut off funding to Harrington. So Harrington didn't really have the funds to pay Rogers to proceed. Well, Rogers, though, his work with Harrington had caught the attention of the newly renamed Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. And so in April 1924, one of the trustees went to Rogers and said, "How about if you do some excavations for us?" And so Rogers knew about another archaeological site, this one down there on Modoc Road at a place called, we know today as Cieneguitas. And he had done some interviews where he had, and actually produced a sketch map of where the Indians were living at the end of the 19th century. And so Cieneguitas was a Chumash community of Barbareño Chumash Indians who had been at Mission Santa Barbara. And then after the mission was secularized, most of the Indian families moved down to Cieneguitas off of what today is called Modoc Road, and had built little adobes and did farming right in that area. And so Rogers, was through his interviews was documenting this. So he knew that there was an archaeological site there, an even older archaeological site these Indian houses were on top of. And so he went down there and did some excavations, and we still have those collections here at the museum today. But he was, then after that was completed, he was still seeking funds to continue. And in his letters to Harrington, he's still bringing this up. He averages about 2 to 3 letters a month to Harrington between April 1924 up until the beginning of 1925. And he also mentions that after that first dig, that he was then, the museums, some of the trustees of the museum then gave him some funds to do some additional archaeological work. He refers to us as the local museum. And then in August, he reported that he is again on the rocks financially. And the museum was apparently, some of the people who'd been funding him were not so enamored with some of the archaeological material that he was finding. And he notes that they expected a King Tut's treasure instead of the kinds of artifacts that he had been uncovering. But they must not have been too dissatisfied with him. And well, in the fall, Rogers mentions also that in the course of doing his work, he's compiled about 200 pages of notes and a series of scaled maps of the excavations that he'd been undertaking. And then, he was constantly inquiring to Harrington, what are the real prospects for employment for him? Trying to get Harrington to commit himself to more work. Well, the museum must not have been too dissatisfied with what Rogers was finding, because on January 30th, Rogers wrote to Harrington that he's just been appointed the official archaeologist at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. And he said he would then begin immediately going to Carpinteria to do excavations at Mishopshno, which is the Chumash town where the present day Carpinteria Beach State Park is located. And he says, I stand ready to serve, meaning that he's still willing to work with Harrington, but he's now handicapped because of his new job at the museum. And by August 12th, the museum trustees were so satisfied with the work he was doing that they apparently had decided they were going to continue with him, with the museum. So Rogers, between 1925 and 1926, he conducted archaeological field work at a number of sites all along the Santa Barbara coastal mainland. And this photograph is taken in front of a house up there on a road there behind, near where the San Marcos Foothill Reserve is located. And he did excavations there in the front yard at this house. This house is still standing there. And, but his communications with Harrington, or from Harrington to Rogers, virtually cease. And Rogers writes, to all intents and purposes, you are presently completely lost to me. We don't know the reason for Harrington breaking off his correspondence with Rogers, whether he was upset that Rogers had accepted a job with the museum when they had this plan that they were going to implement together, or whether perhaps Harrington was just involved with other things and had lost, interest in what Rogers was up to. We don't really know the reason for their correspondence being broken off. Rogers made beautiful maps, and this is an example. This is his work, a map that he made showing the sites where he'd conducted excavations down at what today is at the mouth of Tecolote Canyon, near where the Bacara Ritz-Carlton Resort is located today. And in January 1927, the Chumash Indian Hall opened here at the museum. And Rogers displayed many of the artifacts that he'd been discovering in his excavations. And you can also see there's some Chumash baskets there that had been donated to the museum that were also on exhibit. So this is what the first Chumash Hall looked like. Those cases are still there. Our exhibits are different today. But he wasn't done. And in 1927, he launched a series of expeditions to Santa Cruz and Santa Rosa Island, where they did excavations around those two islands. And then by the end of 1927, Rogers was busy working on what became his book. And so there he is on the lower left. You can see here's a couple of articles in our museum leaflet at the time. And he was going to talk about his work on the Channel Islands and in January 1928. And then on the upper right, they announce that Rogers is busy preparing his monograph about the excavations at Chumash sites in the Santa Barbara region. And the legend, part of the legends of the halls is that Rogers was working in what today is a storage closet, that was where he did much of the composition of the book. His manuscript was right adjacent to where the Gould Indian Hall is today. There's a storage closet that the visitors don't see, and that was where much of the writing took place for Rogers' book. So then in 1929, June 1929, Rogers' book was finally published, Prehistoric Man of the Santa Barbara Coast, and it immediately got wide acclaim. It got attention all across the country because it was for the first time presenting the information and recognizing that culture had not been static throughout prehistory, that there had been cultural change through time. And on the lower right, there's a poem that was written by John Collier, who just a few years after this, he wrote this poem. He was a sociologist and writer. John Collier was appointed by Franklin D. Roosevelt to become the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he promoted what became known as the Indian New Deal during his tenure at the head of the BIA. Anyway, this is John Collier's poem there on the lower right, in saying he was inspired after reading Prehistoric Man of the Santa Barbara Coast. So in this book, Rogers reported on his excavations and discoveries. He described the characteristics of 96 sites between Rincon and Gaviota. And as I've mentioned, he was the first to recognize that there have been major changes in the prehistoric cultural record over time. He conceived of these as representing three different groups of people who he called the Oak Grove people, the hunting people, and the Canalino. Today, archaeologists no longer think these are three different groups of people, but rather this is in situ cultural change that occurred over time, and we now divide it into the early period, middle period, and late period, roughly equivalent to those terms that Rogers used. Rogers, after the publication of his book, then became the local go-to expert on archaeology and paleontology. And the local newspapers are constantly reporting on his activities, what he's up to, what he's discovering. He contributed frequently to the museum leaflet on articles on paleontology and archaeology. And as a result of his contributions, he was appointed acting curator in January 1930, and then full curator of anthropology and paleontology in 1932. The newspapers report on his lectures that he was giving to many local groups and school classes. And then in 1935, he was elected president of the Southwestern Archaeology Federation. He also made paleontological contributions. In 1931, the newspaper carried an article about finding Pliocene fossils down near Veronica Springs. And one of the things that he found was a coracoid that's shown below of a new species of cormorant. And it was then described and published by Hildegard Howard, a famous ornithologist. And this is the type specimen of that coracoid shown from different points of view. And she named the cormorant Phalacrocorax rogersi, after David Banks Rogers. This is a photograph taken on a museum field trip led by Rogers to Santa Rosa Island. And here you can see he's surrounded by all of the people who participated in the field trip as he discusses some artifacts that they had found. Here's Rogers dressed in some ethnographic pieces that have been donated to the museum, a Sioux headdress and a Navajo blanket. This photograph was taken just before, a few years before he retired. He also, there are a few last letters that we have of Rogers to Harrington. In 1923, Harrington apparently wrote him asking for return of his camera. All of the photographs published in Prehistoric Man of the Santa Barbara coast were photographs Rogers took using a camera loaned to him by John Harrington. And so he says, it was certainly like parting with an old friend, but I know that I will get along in some way without it. Even as I know I can get along without a human friend of whom I am bereft. So you can see from this that Rogers really regretted the fact that his friendship with Harrington had seemed to come to an end. And only 3 letters were sent to Harrington after that, all deal with items and books that Harrington requested back from Rogers, but which Rogers said he believed he'd returned to Harrington, and thinks that many of them had actually been transferred already to that ironclad building that he had helped Harrington build. On May 3rd, 1937, Rogers writes to Harrington that his wife had died many months ago, and he said, I no longer have a home. I think he meant this sort of metaphorically, because he was, had become a widower. I don't think that he actually lost his home. Anyway, a year later, the Los Angeles Times carried this article, Rogers quits as curator, and successor named. So Rogers retired at age 70 as being curator of anthropology, and Phil Orr was the successor named, also a paleontologist and anthropologist who'd been working at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. Rogers still continued to be involved with the museums, and the California Museums Conference was held at our museum in 1940, and right there is Rogers. There's David Rogers, David Banks Rogers. So he was still participating in museum events. We have another photograph too of another museum conference a few years later in which he also appears. So he was still staying active. So what in the end is the legacy of David Banks Rogers? Well, he was the first to recognize, and as I've said, identify major cultural periods that existed in the past and their relative chronological sequence. He kept detailed field notes, well-drawn maps, and catalog records that we have today here at the museum, which document his excavations and collections. And thus, the collections that we have here, brought together by Rogers, essentially comprise the type collections for defining prehistoric cultural change in the Santa Barbara region. And he also contributed as well to understanding the paleontological record of South Central California. So the sources that I've consulted for this quick biographical sketch of our first curator of anthropology, well, one were United States Census and city directories, the Harrington-Rogers correspondence that are part of the Harrington collection at the National Anthropological Archives in the Smithsonian, Rogers' entry in Who's Who in America, the Cyclopedia of American Biography entry about Rogers, our museum leaflets that are in our museum library that were published between 1925 and 1940, our museum's annual reports, which are also in our library archives, newspaper articles about Rogers that were published. Almost all of these are in clipping albums that are preserved in our museum archives. And then there's also a handwritten biography that was begun by a woman who was a friend of Rogers and his second wife, Wilberta Finley, a much younger woman, but she began working with Rogers to write his biography. And we have a copy of that now in our museum library. In her old age, she donated all of the papers she had pertaining to Rogers to our museum. We also have other Rogers memorabilia that was donated to us in 1993. And then Rogers himself was really an avid genealogist. He was really interested in his own family genealogy and conducted quite a bit of genealogical research sort of as a hobby, especially after he retired. And all of those papers were saved by Wilberta Finley and donated to the museum. Then I also availed myself of Ancestry.com to do some background research about Rogers. And I've got to thank the others here on the museum staff, Terry Sheridan and Peggy Dahl, who helped me with this research in the museum archives and library, and Destiny Harrell, our anthropology curatorial assistant, who assisted me by transcribing Rogers' correspondence and some of his field notes. So Rogers, as I have said, made major contributions to understanding prehistory in the Santa Barbara region. And today, the collections and the field notes and maps that he compiled, voluminous, are constantly being consulted by researchers today who come to our museum, both graduate students and also professional archaeologists who come and restudy these collections using new techniques to obtain new information, a new insight. And all of this stems from Rogers' work. So he truly was one of the legends here at the Museum of Natural History. So if anyone has questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, John. I couldn't help but notice when you were talking about Rogers' book that at the time you could get a copy for $2.25.
That's right.
Is that book, can you still get a copy of that book?
Today that book is a collector's item and costs maybe $500 if you're lucky to get it. That would be a cheap copy.
And also your presentation reminded me that we had planned a trip for Leadership Circle members this year to the Burton Mound area, which unfortunately we did have to cancel. But fingers crossed, maybe we can visit next year if things ease up a little bit. So I did jot down a few questions that came in for you. One was, what is ironclad used for today? Because you mentioned that it was still there.
Yes, it actually been converted into a private residence today. And so someone, the current owner lives there.
And another question that came in, were those human remains found at Burton Mound ever dated?
We don't have any direct dates on the human remains themselves. But yes, that's a very good question. You know, how old was that deeply buried stratum there, Burton Mound? We know today that that is the, what we would call the early period. And the calcareous nature of the soil is because of all the leaching of the calcium from the marine shells, from the shell midden there, down into that lower layer and making it very hard to dig in, because there's so much, it's kind of cemented. And those earlier people I would estimate back to about 7,000 to 8,000 years, perhaps. You know, so it is quite an ancient site, but not 25,000 years as was announced in the newspaper. And we also know that genetically, those people were a little bit different than the later people, but those earlier people, so their skulls did look a little bit different than the skulls of the more recent Chumash Indians. And we know from some ancient DNA work that's been done that those earlier people were descended from the very early coastal migration, or very early migrations that peopled the Americas. But later, you know, over thousands of years, other migrations into California resulted in other genetic mixing that took place. And so, but the earlier people left descendants down to people who were here when Europeans arrived too as well, even though there have been some other genetic input over time.
Susan wants to know, did Rogers ever collect any pygmy mammoth material from Santa Rosa Island?
Rogers didn't collect pygmy mammoths from Santa Rosa Island that I know of. However, Dr. John Merritt, who was on our board of trustees some years ago, the late John Merritt, he was a surgeon here in Santa Barbara. He, as a boy, or as a teenager, I think, went out to San Miguel Island with David Banks Rogers. He told me this himself. And they excavated a pygmy mammoth on San Miguel Island. That those bones are here at our museum.
A comment came in just a little earlier. Maybe you could digitize his book and sell it.
Well, actually the book has been digitized. And there is a database where you can go and download the book. but you have to do it through a university library membership in order to do that.
Just one last question. Did the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History have much in the way of archaeological collections before Rogers came on board?
No, we didn't. Yeah, Rogers, the museum had really no, I think, archaeological and I think no ethnographic collections really before Rogers came to the museum. He's the one that built the foundation collections for our anthropology department.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, John, so much. As we close out this week's Legends of the Halls, I'd like to thank John very much for researching such an interesting figure of the museum's past and sharing the story with all of us. If you'd like to contact Dr. Johnson with additional questions, please feel free to email him at jjohnson@sbnature2.org. To all of you, thanks for joining us tonight, and thank you for your support as museum members. We are so grateful to you all for sticking with us, especially during such turbulent times. Let your friends and neighbors know that the museum and Sea Center outdoor spaces are open and to come and visit us soon. And don't miss next week's Legends of the Halls, For Love of Nature, A Gift of Art, on Tuesday, August 13th from 5 to 6 p.m. with our curator of the John and Peggy Maximus Gallery, Linda Miller. Linda will be focusing on the life and legacy of Peggy Maximus and her vision of installing a permanent antique print collection and exhibit space here at the museum. The Maximus Gallery is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. Until then, feel free to contact me with any if you'd like to more information or about our Leadership Circles program or have any suggestions for future Legends of the Halls topics, and stay connected with all museum and Sea Center activities on our website at sbnature.org. Stay safe, stay strong, stay positive, everyone, and we'll see you soon.